Can you tell us about the Jewish community in Germany before the Nazis came to power in 1933?
Before the war, Jews in Germany made up less than 1% of the population of the country. This is a statistic that shocks a lot of people. So really a very, very tiny minority whose significance and role were completely exaggerated by the Nazis in order to exploit them as a focus for, to unify people around fear of them and a paranoia around Jews. They were an overwhelmingly urban population, but still there were some who lived in small areas. Like any other community or any other group of people, there were wealthy ones and impoverished ones and different types. But really also to look that overall in Europe before World War II, there were approximately 9 million Jews living in every country across Europe. And they were not a community. To talk about Jewish people or the Jews as a monolith is really artificial. They did not necessarily share one language, and they were not necessarily religious. But when the Nazis came to power, their vision was to have not only a Germany that would be free of Jews, but a Europe that would be free of Jews. So the elimination of Jews, first by immigration, by pushing them to leave, not through wholesale slaughter, but by making life so uncomfortable, so impossible that they would leave, was their initial plan.
And what was their plan before coming to power? Did they have planned to basically get rid of only German Jews or the European Jewry in total?
Really unclear what their plans were before. And this has been a kind of long debate among historians, whether it was always their intention to commit genocide or whether it was something that evolved. But what is known without question is that the decision to commit genocide, after which there was no turning back, was made sometime in 1941. But there is no singular smoking gun document. There's nothing with Adolf Hitler's signature on it or with other top Nazi officials that predates the beginning of what are mass shootings.
Was the German Jewish community well blended in with the rest of the society, or it was a kind of limited community? Because if it was well blended, then we would say it was like really difficult job to like kind of distinguish them and eradicate them.
So compared to many European countries, the Jewish population in Germany was actually quite assimilated and well integrated. It was not a population that was overwhelmingly, let's say, Orthodox with very distinctive dress or kind of certain types of look that you might think of as a traditional Jew. There were some, but there were many, and German Jews, they mostly sent their children to public schools. Many of them were intermarried, married to Christian Germans. Dressed the same, ate the same. That doesn't mean they weren't affiliated in some way. And in Germany, to this day, there is an official state-recognized Jewish community called the Gemeinde. And so from their roles, their kind of directory of members, that was a first place to start, but actually tracking down and identifying who is Jewish, who was Jewish, was part of the Nazis' task. And it became increasingly complicated as they went into war and took over other territory where they didn't have access to central records necessarily in the same way.
Question about the connection between the Aryanization project and the Holocaust, and how, because what we see in terms of the Aryanization is a process of confiscating these properties, which is quite comparable to what we see in Iran. In the last session, we talked to Patricia and Edna about how, Patricia and Krista, about how these crimes were happening without the German population actually knowing a lot about that. But the Aryanization is something that you couldn't hide. So it was somehow happening before the Holocaust. So how this happened, and is there actually any connection between these two? And how would the German population react to that? Because that was something that no one could deny knowing about.
Your question makes me think actually about some really intriguing documents that we have at the museum that are advertisements that appeared in German newspapers in the mid to late 1930s for auctions that were taking place of confiscated, so-called Aryanized Jewish property. And it would advertise that on such and such date, there will be a public auction, and then there would be a full inventory of what would be available. This many dishes, this many house linens, kitchen equipment, china, all the things that make up someone's personal, intimate life. And the thing that's always struck me about that, not only seeing, and we have photographs of people at these auctions buying, but what it shows about knowledge. Because if someone has been taken away, if your neighbor has been taken away, and suddenly the public authorities are selling off everything that happened in their house, they are not coming back. You don't need to be a very sophisticated thinker to draw that conclusion. I think a child could draw that conclusion. Nazi officials, Nazi German government was very sensitive to public opinion and would kind of test run incremental measures to see what a population, general population, would tolerate, what they would embrace, what made them upset. And these auctions were ways also to placate people, to have them have some kind of benefit from the removal of their Jewish neighbors or people they knew in class, fellow students. And also it gave them an incentive. I think it is very comfortable and inaccurate to think about the German population as somehow brainwashed or just like rabidly hateful. There certainly were a proportion, and we think based on kind of early public opinion polls at the time, it was around 20% who were like full true believers in all of the Nazi agenda. But many other people had much more human and much more relatable motives that I think you and I might be able to empathize with. The final solution, as we call it, which is really using a German euphemism again, it's really the final stage of the Holocaust, and it starts in 1941. Many Jews were killed before this, but that is when the German state starts to marshal all of its resources for this purpose. As a historian, I don't usually like to do kind of counter history, like what if this had happened, but many people have argued, and I think persuasively, that if Nazi Germany had not been so intent on killing millions and millions of civilians, of Jewish civilians, perhaps they could have won the war. They diverted huge amounts of resources, of personnel, of trains, of energy, of attention to this project. And unfortunately, they were quite successful at it. So the one thing that we do know is that after the decision to do this was made sometime in 1941, and shooting massacres were the initial method of choice, Then in January of 1942, top-ranking Nazi officials met at a villa in a suburb of Berlin called Wannsee and discussed how to do this more systematically. If you think about the mass murder of millions and millions of human beings across vast territory, often in the setting of war, it's a big logistical challenge. How do you transport them? What are the techniques for killing? We have engineering drawings. This was a competitive bidding process. People had to come up with a way to design a gas chamber that could kill hundreds and hundreds of people quickly, efficiently. These are factories, an industrial scale death. Someone had to decide what was the best design. Someone had to build it, recruit construction workers and people with technical expertise to make it happen, needed to decide which chemical to use. And many of them may not have been doing direct killing, but did kind of their normal desk job, were a procurement specialist who made sure that there was sufficient transport for the canisters of the Zyklon B, which is the poison gas that came in a kind of pellet form.
It was very interesting what you said about many kind of people, many companies were involved logistically in the process. And for example, we in France, we have also SNCF, which is a train company that deported Jews at the time and still exists. So, were they aware that, okay, we are involved in this kind of crime or not?
It's, literally the $1 million question. It varies from place to place. I'm glad that you mentioned the French railway. That's an example. And also to make sure that we are broadening our thinking about this far beyond Germany, because part of why the Holocaust is such a seminal event is most genocides happen within a particular country, and this is a transnational genocide. So the circles of collaboration and complicity ripple thousands of miles outward. The French railway, for example, has made a really admirable effort to have an honest reckoning with its past and to pay some kind of reparations as a sign of guilt, because the deportations of Jews from France could not have happened without them. It's not as though the Germans sent their trains and built a whole new set of railways, and it was, French police who facilitated this. To look at a very famous example, like from pop culture, Oskar Schindler, like the movie Schindler's List, was originally quite chummy with the Nazis and with the occupation authorities because he was able to get basically free workers to work in his ceramics factory. So the profit motive is also extremely big. And again, I'm not in any way saying that hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism is not important. Nothing happens without it, but it is not the sole motivator that made so many people join in. So of the 6 million, 2.7 million, or close to 3, were killed in gas chambers. And these are numbers that we know because the Germans themselves kept track. So 2.7 million in gas chambers, as many as 2 million in mass shootings. And again, these are numbers that we know based on reports that were sent back. Some of these killing squads needed to track how much ammunition they were using. They kept records. And then the rest, approximately 1 million more, died in ways that included conditions in ghettos or in concentration camps, forced starvation, and disease in ghettos. And we have, again, from the Germans themselves, photographs of emaciated children dying or close to or already dead lying on the streets of ghettos. Concentration camps and death camps were places of arbitrary violence and mass beatings. Many, many Jews were worked to death as slaves. There were mobile gas vans before the stationary gas chambers were built at the 6 killing centers in occupied Poland. And then also at the end of the war, as the Germans were losing, they evacuated surviving prisoners from many camps and marched them for weeks to their deaths without shoes. They would shoot them if they fell out of line. One more example, even during the deportations in the cattle cars, those could last for days or a week. There was no food. There was obviously no air conditioning, no heat, packed in 100, 120 people in a car. Many people would die on the way. So that last million is a whole combination of the kind of factors that I just described. It's really brutal, terrible stuff. So.
For me, it's interesting because at the same time that we talk about the fact that a lot of this was incremental, right? And at the same time, we call this the final solution. But it was really obviously building up to it. How do you see the decision-making process that ultimately got to the point of the so-called final solution? Are there accounts of disagreements among them? The high-level decision makers on this at all?
So, their psychology, I don't know. The documents that they left, I don't know, don't really speak to state of mind. As I said, for the Wannsee Conference, which is really the official documentary start of the final solution in January 42, there is no evidence of disagreement. What is indisputable is that from summer 41, this was the official policy of Nazi Germany, because every place that they invaded, they undertook this. But they did not do it themselves. They were completely reliant on local collaborators, and in many places, collaborators or local officials acted without them. And I want to remind ourselves also that we're talking about human beings here, real, actual people. Like if you took each murder that happened during the Holocaust and had it happen in a so-called more normal setting, it would merit its own investigation, its own tracking down of the killers, hopefully a trial, assembly of evidence, a punishment. But because it is in this mass of millions of people, I think it's easy to lose track of that. But why, if I can take your question a little farther, why do we talk about the Holocaust so much? These were not out of the way. They were next to the towns. They needed help from local people, not just to do the shootings, but if you're traveling around for months and months as a killing squad, you need to eat. Who's cooking your food? Who's giving you a place to sleep? Who's washing the blood and bone fragments out of your uniform at the end of the day? It's local people. And we can ask them, and in fact, we have asked them at the Holocaust Museum. We have a totally unique collection of collaborator and bystander testimony where we've asked some people, why did you help? And the motivations were different. Some people were afraid. Some people wanted to curry favor with occupying force. Some were paid. But it took a lot of help to do this. That to me is really what is more fascinating and at the end of the day, much, much more disturbing.
Based on what you just said, I think that what happened was that the Nazi regime actually industrialized mass murder, and so consequently it actually commercialized mass killing as well. So there is massive infrastructure involved in doing these mass murders. So were there any consequences for the companies who actually involved in facilitating these operations?
So short answer is yes. And a lot of these, I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but there are many cases of corporations, especially German ones, companies like Volkswagen or Mercedes, Krupp, many big multinationals that still exist, paid reparations either to groups of survivors Or like I remember being a child and going to Israel in the mid 80s and being completely confused because a lot of the taxi cabs were Mercedes, which to me was like the most deluxe. And that was actually like, I was told, a kind of reparations thing that they, I think, sold subsidized cars or something to the Jewish state. So different companies have dealt with it in different ways. Many have not. I mean, there are a lot of universities in Germany that also profited or somehow were complicit with the Nazi regime and have not really had a reckoning with that. Probably some of the biggest cases that have made the news are about both insurance companies that have refused to pay claims to Jewish families that lost property or lost family members, and also banks, Swiss banks especially, that functioned as a shelter. So it's a whole complicated other topic. I would love to talk to you about it another time. And I'm also not one of the world's foremost experts on it, but there is a lot of good research. But the short answer is there were some reckonings, but tiny proportion. I would say it's symbolic and in no way at all proportional to the profits that were made.
So you could say that that wasn't proportionate, the type of kind of remedy that was provided.
Absolutely not.
How can we define guilt when 6 million people are killed in such an organized, industrialized fashion? Because there is a commander, of course, who orders it, who orders the killing, but there is someone who prepares food for the commander. And without that food, the commander dies. And someone builds the house for that commander. Someone builds the barracks. Someone builds those furnaces. How can we draw a line and say that this person is guilty and that person is not guilty and she or he was just doing their job?
I look at two factors for that. And again, I'm not a judge and I'm not God. So neither in a legal nor moral sense is it for me to say, but it's something I've thought about for many years. The two factors I look at are knowledge and choice. The knowledge is about what did a person know and what could they have known, because we can choose to know things or not, and there's willful blindness, as I mentioned earlier. So if I am a policeman, I'm a gendarme in Paris, in 1941, and I am being told by occupation authorities, who I may or may not like, I may resent them, to round up people in the city and bring them to trains for I don't know what purpose. Is it my responsibility to find out for what purpose? Do I call in sick that day? Which goes to the question again of choice also. But let me take it to a more extreme setting, and this may surprise you. Some of the mobile killing squads that are operating on the Eastern Front, so in a less orderly location than wartime Paris, they're doing the shooting massacres that I described. There was discretion there too. It was thought for many years that if you were a member of one of these squads, and they were not just Einsatzgruppen, which are the mobile squads, but also members of police units and other kinds, that if you were there, you had to do it or you would be shot yourself. That is not true. I'd recommend a terrific book by a historian named Christopher Browning. It's called Ordinary Men, where he studied extensive testimony from post-war trials of members of these squads and commanders. And there was a huge range in what people did. For example, one of these order police battalions that was working in occupied Eastern Poland, the commander of the unit made it clear to his subordinates that he did not like these orders, that he didn't feel that's what he was sent to do, that he was trained to do, and he did not like these mass killings of civilians. How did he make it clear? In the tone in which he gave the order, and that he himself rarely or never went to the killing sites. He would tell them what to do, where to go, and then he would go back to his headquarters or something. In his unit, the number of men who stepped out, who said, I won't do this, or after a day of shooting said, I can't continue to do this, was much, much higher than in units where the commanders were enthusiastic, participated themselves, showed endorsement, And much to my surprise, and I imagine your surprise, the consequences were little or none. Maybe they got harassed or ridiculed by their colleagues. None of them were killed. They were not even imprisoned. They were usually transferred to another unit because they just didn't have the stomach for it. So imagine if more commanders and more people had said, I won't do this, or I can't do this, as opposed to either being enthusiastic about it or drinking themselves into an alcoholic stupor to make it possible, which is what many of them did. So they had agency, they had choice. And that's one of the things that I think is so fascinating, is to see that things could have been different. It can be tempting to think about the Holocaust like a natural disaster. A typhoon starts and it's coming and the wall of water is coming and there's nothing you can do. But in fact, there are so many cases like this, not enough, that show that there was agency and possibility.
Coming to the end of the session, tell us, Edna, why did you choose to become a Holocaust historian?
I think it's really because of two things. One is that the Holocaust is the best documented crime in history. There is no other event, no cataclysm from which we have so much evidence, whether it's documents, whether it's eyewitness testimony, photographs, objects, sites of atrocity, with a great deal of it, as I mentioned, left by the perpetrators themselves. So it's just a really unique case study in that we can look at it and examine it from so many perspectives. But also, I think for anyone who's curious about human nature and democracy and how societies either fall apart or strengthen, it's just kind of the ultimate example in what we can look at. What makes human beings do these things, do horrible things, do incredible things? And are there elements of those that we can try to reinforce in the communities that we love and care about?
And how do you react when you hear someone like our leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, or our former president, Ahmadinejad, deny the Holocaust on a regular basis?
My gut reaction is that it serves a purpose for the denier when they deny. I mean, it's just indisputable. Someone could quarrel over differences in statistics, and, real historians do. But when you look at something that is so patently true, there has to be another agenda, and that it's often in the service of distraction also. I mentioned the Nazi German regime as being opportunistic, and I think most repressive regimes are opportunistic, that they know it's been proven, and you can look at this history again to see the effectiveness of fear, of demonization of an outside force or of a domestic minority, as a way to consolidate control of your own population. I'm not at all an expert on Iran, but it just seems to me like a playbook that I've seen before, and that I have confidence. I have had the pleasure of meeting a lot of Iranian people over the years of my work, and that people know when they're being played, and when it's something that is designed to be a red herring, if you know that expression, something to get you to like, oh, look over there, something shiny, so you won't see what's happening. So I always feel that there's some agenda behind denial of something that is so obviously true. And it makes me sad because of the memory of the human beings who were murdered. But like any conspiracy theory, I think that curious, smart people who want to examine evidence when it's there will see through it. And so I think it's dangerous, but it doesn't make me despair.